Christ for the world we sing, the world to Christ we bring, with loving zeal, the poor and them that mourn, the faint and overborne, sin sick and sorrow worn, whom Christ doth heal. Christ for the world we sing, the world to Christ we bring, with fervent prayer, the wayward and the lost, by restless passions tossed, redeemed at countless cost from dark despair.
Hello, welcome to our Bible study. My name is Clint McElroy, and today we'll be in 1 Kings chapter 11. We will be meeting today at 10 a.m., so please join us if you can. Hope to see you there. If you're sick in any way, please don't come to the auditorium, but instead stay home and enjoy the streaming service. We'll also be having classes at 9 a.m., so please join us for those if you can. We'll be watching this class on the large screen in the auditorium, and you're welcome to join us there for that. We want everyone to remember that we have these English Standard Version Bibles available from the World Bible School. If you'd care to have one, please call our church office and we'll make arrangements to get you one. Our sick list is long, so please refer to our bulletin for more information. Printed versions should be available in the foyer. As is our custom, we want to remember the story of the two men on the road to Emmaus who were joined by a third man on the way. When they got to their destination, that third man left their presence after he revealed himself to be Jesus, the resurrected Savior. The men recollected that while he was with them, there had been a burning in their hearts. It's that burning that they had in their hearts that we hope to kindle in our own as we draw closer to the Lord through a study of His Word. We also want to remember the admonitions of Leviticus chapter 19, to be holy for the Lord our God is holy. And we want to remember the admonitions from the stories of Rehoboam and Jeroboam and the prophet that came to Jeroboam, which we'll be studying in detail in coming weeks. These stories are very troubling to me because they represent the judgment that God brought upon the people of Israel because of the sins of Solomon, and they manifested themselves in sins committed by Rehoboam and Jeroboam. It's a very sad story, and it's very troubling. Perhaps most troubling in the story is the story of the prophet that came to Jeroboam. It's troubling because it represents exactly what Jeroboam did to the people of Israel. The prophet that came to Jeroboam did exactly what he was supposed to do, up and into going home after having done the things that he was instructed to do. Instead of going directly home as he'd been told to do, he was met on the way by another prophet who, having heard about this first prophet, wanted the company of his presence as an honor for himself, came to the first prophet and lied to him and told him that the Lord had come to him and said that he should come and visit him for a meal. This sounded good to this first prophet, and the first prophet went and had that meal. And this was counted as a sin against him that required his life before he got home. And this is a story that represents the sin that Jeroboam imposed on the people. Jeroboam did exactly what the Lord had wanted Jeroboam to do. He brought judgment against Israel, divided the kingdom, and took control of the northern tribes. And in doing so, he set himself up to be king over those tribes. And the Lord said that he would be blessed if he would follow the Lord's direction and obey him. But instead of doing that, he did what was in his own mind the right and proper thing to do. He denied the people the opportunity to worship in Jerusalem as they were instructed to do, and instead told them that they should worship at high places that he set up in the mountains. He set up a false priesthood to support this, and the worship that entailed there was never anything but an abomination before the Lord. What a terrible thing to be deceived by someone when you've nearly done your task, to be carried away into falsehood, which separates us from God. It's a terrible circumstance to find ourselves in, and we only have one way to guard against it, and that's to trust that God will provide direction through revelation through his word. We have to study. We have to study to show ourselves approved. Workmen who need not be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth. We do that by studying. So that's why we engage in study. We study so we will not be deceived. We will not be caught off guard. We will have an answer when someone asks why we believe and do the things we do. We will be ready to spread that word at that opportunity when it presents itself. So I hope you'll join me now as we enter into this study. We'll be reviewing chapters 10 and 11. We did the reading last week, so join me now as we read the first 8 verses of chapter 11, and then we'll start our discussion about chapters 10 and 11. 1 Kings chapter 11, verses 1 through 8. Now King Solomon loved many foreign women, along with the daughter of Pharaoh, Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonian, and Hittite women, from the nations concerning which the Lord had said to the people of Israel, You shall not enter into marriage with them, neither shall they with you, for surely they will turn away your heart after their gods. Solomon clung to these in love. Verse 3. He had 700 wives who were princesses and 300 concubines, and his wives turned away his heart. For when Solomon was old, his wives turned away his heart after other gods, and his heart was not wholly true to the Lord his God, as was the heart of David his father. For Solomon went after Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and after Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. Verse 6. So Solomon did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and did not wholly follow the Lord, as David his father had done. Then Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, and for Molech, the abomination of the Ammonites, on the mountain east of Jerusalem. And so he did for all his foreign wives, who made offerings and sacrifice to their gods. So, last time we read all of chapter 11, so we'll return to these verses momentarily, but we want to go back now to the happenings of chapter 10. We see in chapter 10 that the Queen of Sheba came to visit Solomon, and this was at an earlier point, I take it, from the way the story is presented in 1 Kings. When Solomon was more acceptable to the Lord in his behavior. And when the Queen of Sheba came in the first few verses of chapter 10, she came to test him with hard questions, it says in verse 1. And with very great retinue she came. So she came with a whole host of people representing her kingdom, and with precious spices and much gold and precious stones. And she came to Solomon and told him all that was on her mind. So in verse 2, it makes it clear that she had the intention of testing Solomon and brought him all these things that were on her mind. And it says in verse 3, Solomon answered all her questions. There was nothing hidden from the king that he could not explain to her. So he was given knowledge about things. I take it as miraculous revelation from the Lord, an understanding of things perhaps which he had never studied before, but when she asked about them, he was able to explain their workings. And when, in verse 4, the Queen of Sheba had seen all the wisdom of Solomon, the house he had built, the food on his table, the seating of his officials and the attendance of his servants, their clothing, his cupbearers, and his burnt offerings that he offered at the house of the Lord, there was no more breath in her. She was breathtaking to see the wonder of the abundance and the just overdone nature of everything that he did. And it's just when we think of maybe the royal families in Europe throughout history, and particularly now, the great splendor in which they live, the great wonder of their personal retinue, the people that attend to their every need and look after everything that they need, their clothing, the things that they enjoy from day to day, the royal crest that is shown by vendors who sell their wares to the king, and the king in England comes to mind. It's a very prominent thing that people who sell their wares to the king get to do. This is a very telling thing about the way that Solomon's disposition was and his bearing as being king before the people. So she said finally in verse 6, the report was true that I heard in my own land of your words and of your wisdom, but I did not believe the reports until I came and My own eyes had seen it, and behold, the half was not told me. Your wisdom and your prosperity surpassed the report that I heard. Happy are your men, happy are your servants, who continually stand before you and hear your wisdom. Blessed be the Lord your God, who has delighted in you and set you on the throne of Israel. Because the Lord loved Israel forever, he has made you king, that you may execute justice and righteousness. That's a wonderful report to have made by someone who has observed you and anything that you do. But if you're a king particularly, that you may execute justice and righteousness. That is an incredible thing, something that is increasingly lost on our public servants nowadays. They are sworn to execute justice and righteousness before us according to our Constitution, and so many of them choose not to do that for one reason or another, and that is it's a bane on our society. Continuing, then she gave the king 120 talents of gold and a very great quantity of spices and precious stones. Never again came such an abundance of spices as these that the queen of Sheba gave to King Solomon. So she honored Solomon greatly for the opportunity that she had to visit with him. Solomon also honored her. He gave her what she wanted of what he had, as it says in verse 13. It says in verse 11 that the fleet of Hiram, which brought gold from Ophir, brought from Ophir a very great amount of almug wood and precious stones. The king made of the almug wood supports for the house of the Lord, and for the king's house also lyres, harps. For the singers, no such almug wood has come or been seen to this day. So this was a special kind of wood, and this must possibly be referring back to the final steps of adorning the temple and the king's home, which, although they're presented in a serial fashion in the text, may not have been completely serial. They might have been done somewhat in parallel. I wish that was made clear in the text. The text makes it very clear and is very ordered, and it seems to indicate that the temple was built first, then the king's buildings were built. That said, verse 13 does say, King Solomon gave to the queen of Sheba all that she desired, whatever she asked besides what was given her by the bounty of King Solomon. So she turned and went back to her own land with her servants. So that's an interesting statement. You know, exactly what that means, I'm not sure. Apparently, when she desired something that was in possession of Solomon and made it known to King Solomon, he gave it to her. And that is an impressive thing to be able to do and to have done, certainly. Then it goes on to describe Solomon's great wealth in verses 14 and following, the great abundance of gold. So much gold and wealth was available to King Solomon that silver was counted as nothing in his kingdom. It was just a common metal used for decoration among common things, not special things. And it describes the great wealth that was brought into Solomon's kingdom, and then finally even to the ships of Tarshish that would come in bringing gold, silver, ivory, apes, and either baboons or peacocks, depending on which footnote you want to believe. It says in verse 23, King Solomon excelled all the kings of the earth in riches and in wisdom, and the whole earth sought the presence of Solomon to hear his wisdom, which God had put into his mind. Every one of them brought his present, articles of silver and gold, garments, myrrh, spices, horses, mules, and so much year by year. Solomon gathered together chariots and horsemen. Says he was basically a trader in chariots. It says that this, in so doing, the king's traders exported to all the kings of the Hittites and the kings of Syria. So basically, they provided weapon systems to their neighboring countries, which would inevitably become their enemies at some point in the future, which might be worthy of note. Then, continuing on into chapter 11, the bad news starts. And, you know, if you were watching a special, this is where everything turns sour. King Solomon loved many foreign women. He loved these women that he came into relationships with largely because of political maneuvering and manipulations and treaties and such. And these women were given to him as brides so that they would have a relationship with the kingdoms that they came from. It says that 700 were princesses. This meant that they were princesses of foreign kings, and then 300 were concubines that were given to him as basically slave wives. I would guess that they were presents made to the king from foreign dignitaries who had been slave wives or potential slave wives wherever they came from. It's hard to understand concubines. I don't think that the word is even used consistently throughout the Old Testament. And of course, because he loved these women that he came to be in contact with, his heart was turned away. And it makes the admonition here that the Lord had warned the people of Israel not to be in relationships with these self-same people that he had made these relationships with. So, of course, they continued to worship their false gods in the presence of Solomon and Israel, and he was obliged, because of his relationship with them, to help them do so. And that is what turned him from the Lord, and he was not able to follow the Lord his God with his whole heart, as David his father had done, according to verse 4. And then it describes the gods that he went into, and of course, if you make any study of these gods, which I don't recommend, they are terrible gods that did terrible things, expected terrible things from their people who worshiped them. Just great abominations were done. But it's certainly, while of course this was among the people, it was also an abomination in the sight of the Lord. And it drew Solomon's focus from the Lord onto these false gods. And it goes on talking about how Solomon built these temples, basically, for certain of these gods on the mountains adjacent to Jerusalem. That was a terrible thing to do within the side of the temple, the holy place of God. And it makes you wonder what was in his mind that would let him be so drawn away. The rest of the chapter talks extensively about the adversaries that were brought up against him because he had stirred up the anger of the Lord. But it doesn't talk about what the adversaries necessarily did. It just gives kind of background on who they were. And I find that very interesting because we don't really know much more about them than what is said here. But it goes into this detail about who they are and where they came from and why they might be at odds with Solomon and David. And then finally it ends the chapter on a description of where Jeroboam came from. Jeroboam, it says in verse 26, was the son of Nebat, an Ephraimite of Zereda, a servant of Solomon, whose mother's name was Zeruiah. A widow also lifted up his hand against the king, it says in verse 26. And this was the reason why he lifted up his hand against the king. Solomon built a Millo and closed up the breach of the city of David, his father. The man Jeroboam was very able, and when Solomon saw that the young man was industrious, he gave him charge over all the forced labor of the house of Joseph. So basically Jeroboam was put in charge of the slave labor that served the various activities of possibly construction or maintenance. And then it tells the story of Ahijah coming to Jeroboam and being dressed in this new garment, and then he takes it and tears it into 12 pieces and tells Jeroboam to take for himself 10 pieces, and then describes the judgment that would come upon Israel because of the sins of Solomon, and that Jeroboam would take those 10 tribes that were represented by the 10 pieces of the garment, and they would become a nation. Israel and David would be represented by Rehoboam with a single tribe. And it goes to some extent to kind of describe that. But most important here, it says here in verses 38 and following, and if you will listen to all that I command you, and will walk in my ways and do what is right in my eyes, by keeping my statutes and my commandments, as David my servant did, I will be with you and will build you a sure house, as I built for David, and I will give Israel to you, and I will afflict the offspring of David because of this, but not forever. So he makes the same promise that he's made more or less to Solomon and David, that if he will serve him, he would be he would be blessed. And this is an incredible thing to have from the Lord. And we'll see later how poorly this was received by Jeroboam. This put Jeroboam at odds with Solomon, and it says in verse 40 that Solomon sought therefore to kill Jeroboam. So Jeroboam arose and fled to Egypt, to Shishak, king of Egypt, and was in Egypt until the death of Solomon. So this seems to be later, because this is apparently not the same king that Hadad is described as being with. Of course, it doesn't really name that king. It tells some of the names of the relatives of that king in the story of Hadad in the earlier part of the chapter that we did not review. But Shishak here is the king that Jeroboam presents himself to. And he stays there until the death of Solomon. And then we hear the conclusion of the matter in verse 41 and following. Now the rest of the acts of Solomon and all that he did and his wisdom, are they not written in the book of the acts of Solomon? And the time that Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel was 40 years. And Solomon slept with his fathers and was buried in the city of David his father. And Rehoboam his son reigned in his place. It's not judgmental in that statement, but it's a negative ending based on the rest of the content of the chapter. It's a sad statement. It's a sad thing to have said about you, having been one of the great kings of Israel, the one who built the temple into its highest form, and who did so much to serve and honor the Lord, and yet was carried away in the end. And that is what I really think the two chapters go together very well about. We see how wealthy and great Solomon was, and sometimes we wonder why the Lord doesn't bless us and with the same great wealth of abundance, when we in our minds think we would do wonderful things for him if only we had the wealth that was available to do it. I'm sure you've had that thought. We are, above all people on the earth, blessed. We live as kings live in other countries, and throughout history, certainly so. We live as kings lived in historical circumstances. Individually here, that we amass wealth and possessions with ridiculous abundance. We have more than we should ever assume would be given to us in a life historically. It's just ridiculous. And yet we think if we had that much more, the Lord, we would serve you better. We don't serve the Lord well enough with what we have. Until we serve the Lord well enough with what we have, what place should we ever have stating that he should give us more? The Lord blesses us as he sees fit, and he understands our service before him better than we do. And his expectations of our service are that we obey him, and he desires obedience more than whatever honor that we can come up with in our own minds to bring before him out of the wealth that he gives us. He doesn't want the return of wealth that he's given us instead of obedience. He wants obedience. He wants us to do the things that he set out before us to do. And once we do those things, then he says we'll benefit as we need to benefit in his service. And he makes that a promise in the New Testament. That's not a question mark. That's an absolute fact. When we serve the Lord, he will make provision for us as necessary for our benefit. And that's not preaching a doctrine of wealth. It's not what I'm talking about. He's not going to make us wealthy. He's going to make provision for us. We're going to be taken care of. And we'll be taken care of the way the Lord needs us to be taken care of. And if that means we suffer somewhat and are uncomfortable from time to time, that's what that means. The Lord does not guarantee us a comfortable existence. Quite the contrary. He said that we would most likely suffer great indignities in his service. And certainly if we're doing it right, we should be suffering great indignities. So I really think that's the story here that we can take away from the story of Solomon. Solomon had everything that we could imagine we would ever want. Solomon had it at his disposal. Every understanding, every experience, everything that in the mind of man is what he thinks he wants, Solomon had. And because he had those things, particularly these women in chapter 11, he was drawn away through fear of losing those things instead of fear of the Lord. He feared that he would lose these women who he had not done anything to acquire except be king. And in doing so, he separated himself from the Lord. What a terrible, terrible thing. And that's just one thing. It was his stories of wisdom. When we go and look at the Proverbs, they're stories of things that prove how worthless these things that we value in our minds are. We need to come to the Lord in an understanding that the things in this world are worthless unless they're bent into service of the Lord. And Ecclesiastes makes that as clear as anything that's written in the Bible. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher, all is vanity. The things that Solomon did, they came to nothing. The experiences that he had, the wisdom that he enjoyed, it came to nothing. And it was compounded by his failure. And all that he had, he failed to serve the Lord properly and was not acceptable to the Lord. And judgment was brought on Israel because he failed to stay true to the Lord. What a terrible, terrible thing to be said about you. And I hope that is of some value to you. We will be continuing in our study here for the next few chapters. I think we'll go through chapter 14, and we'll leave the kings after Rehoboam and Jeroboam for a later continuation of this study. And I'm thinking we'll go on and study Matthew. I'm reading Matthew right now in my personal readings, and I've found great interest in what I'm finding there, and I'm encouraged to go there and start a study there. Maybe we'll go through the book of Matthew in the coming weeks. I hope you found a word of encouragement in today's study. We will be meeting today at 10 a.m. Please join us if you can. Hope to see you there. If you're sick in any way, please stay home and enjoy the streaming service. If you feel like you'll be endangered and coming out into ice cold weather, please don't try to do that. Stay home and enjoy the streaming service. God bless. Have a great week.